Maya Jackson had always been a figure of quiet strength. At 32 years old, she had spent the majority of her adult life advocating for the marginalized, working within communities to uplift those who often felt unseen. Today had been no different. She had just finished attending a major fundraising gala for veterans, where she was one of the keynote speakers. Her words had stirred the crowd, igniting discussions about the challenges faced by veterans, particularly Black veterans, upon their return home. It was an event filled with promises of donations, networking, and plans for future initiatives. Despite the public applause and the many hands shaken, Maya felt exhausted. As the evening waned, Maya longed for a moment of solitude. It was in these quiet times, away from the flashing cameras and the polished conversations, that she could breathe and clear her head. She had taken a route home through a neighborhood she hadn't visited in a while, a rougher part of the city that had been the focus of some of her earliest activist work. The area held a special place in her heart, though it had seen its share of turmoil. There had been recent protests and rising tensions between the police and residents. It wasn't the safest route, but Maya trusted herself. She trusted her instincts, and besides, the streets were oddly serene tonight. Maya walked with her head held high, her posture poised. She wore a flowing, olive-green dress that swayed with each step, contrasting sharply with the darkened streets around her. A sense of calm washed over her as she glanced at the run-down buildings and cracked sidewalks, memories of community events she had helped organize in these same streets flashing in her mind. But that calm was interrupted by the hum of a police car engine creeping slowly behind her. Officer Tyler Green sat behind the wheel, his face lit by the pale glow of the dashboard. He had been patrolling this neighborhood for years now. To him, it was a lost cause filled with people he believed didn't want to better themselves. The department often sent officers to these streets as a form of punishment, a demotion of sorts for those who needed retraining or a reminder of their place in the hierarchy. But Green had embraced this grim post. It gave him power over those he silently despised, those he felt didn't belong in the world of law and order. He watched Maya walk along the sidewalk, his eyes narrowing. She stood out. The way she carried herself, the confidence in her stride, it irked him. To Green, people in this neighborhood weren't supposed to have that kind of self-assurance. They should be hunched over, submissive, and always nervous when a cop was nearby. He couldn't quite explain why, but the sight of her walking with such elegance in this area felt like an affront. He made the decision quickly, flipping on his car's lights without bothering to radio in. This stop wasn't about protocol, it was about teaching someone a lesson. Maya heard the car before she saw it, the slow, deliberate rumble that made her instinctively glance over her shoulder. The flashing blue and red lights reflected in her eyes. Her heart rate picked up, not out of fear, but frustration. She had dealt with this before: the unnecessary stops, the veiled accusations, the demands for identification simply because of her race. She thought about ignoring the vehicle and continuing on her way, but she knew better. No need to escalate the situation. Taking a deep breath, she stopped and turned to face the car, her hands visible at her sides. Officer Green stepped out, slamming the door with a bit too much force, as though to announce his authority. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with a menacing scowl etched into his features. His uniform was tight around his frame, the creases stiff and sharp, the shiny badge on his chest gleaming under the streetlights. His hand hovered near his belt, close to the baton, but not quite resting on it. "You got somewhere you need to be," he barked, his voice gruff, filled with unnecessary aggression. Maya blinked at him, keeping her expression neutral. "Just heading home," she replied calmly, her tone measured, devoid of the irritation she felt bubbling beneath the surface. "This is a rough part of town," Green continued, stepping closer. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, evaluating her, trying to find something wrong. "You don't exactly look like you belong here." The insult wasn't subtle, and Maya didn't need him to explain. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the indignation that rose every time she was judged by the color of her skin or the way she carried herself. But she wasn't here to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "I grew up in this neighborhood," she responded, keeping her voice even. "I know it better than most." Green didn't seem to care. He smirked, leaning in just a little closer, his presence invasive. "I bet you do," he muttered, as though her words confirmed some unspoken suspicion. "But that doesn't change the fact that I need to see some ID." Maya considered her options. She could comply, give him what he wanted and let him feel powerful, or she could challenge him, make it clear that he had no right to stop her without cause. But deep down, she knew how these situations could spiral. One wrong move, one refusal, and the encounter could escalate in a way she didn't want to think about. Silently, Maya reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. Her movements were slow, deliberate, ensuring that Green wouldn't have an excuse to claim she was reaching for something else. She handed him her ID, her gaze never leaving his, her expression a mask of calm composure. Officer Green snatched the ID from her hand, glancing at it briefly before pocketing it. He didn't even bother reading it properly. To him, this was about asserting control, not checking her identity. "What are you really doing out here?" he pressed, his tone dripping with condescension. "Just taking a stroll, huh?" Maya felt her patience thinning. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I'm simply walking home." Green's eyes darkened, clearly unsatisfied with her response. He was looking for trouble, and when Maya didn't give him any, it only fueled his frustration. "Walking home at this time of night, through this neighborhood. You expect me to believe that?" Maya straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "You're welcome to believe whatever you want," she said softly, "but that's the truth." For a moment, there was silence. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, thick and palpable. Green's jaw clenched, his hand tightening into a fist by his side. He was used to people backing down, to them offering excuses or begging for leniency. But Maya's quiet strength, her refusal to play the role he expected, infuriated him. Without warning, Green took a step forward and kicked Maya hard in the back of her legs, sending her stumbling to the ground. The impact was sharp, jarring, and for a second, Maya's breath caught in her throat. Pain shot through her knees as they scraped against the rough pavement. She caught herself on her hands, the cold concrete digging into her skin. Slowly she pushed herself up, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Green's. The rage simmered just beneath the surface, but Maya refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing it boil over. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice steady but cold. Green sneered, stepping back as if daring her to challenge him. He had made his move, and now he waited, fully expecting her to break under the pressure. But Maya didn't move. Instead, she slowly rose to her feet, her eyes never leaving his, as if silently telling him that this wasn't over. And in that moment, something shifted in the air, a cold certainty settling over her. "You really don't know who I am," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge of something dangerous. Green's smirk faltered for just a second, but his bravado returned quickly. "Doesn't matter who you are," he spat, but there was an underlying uncertainty in his voice now. Maya's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough." And with those words, the real game had begun. The blow from Officer Green still stung, but Maya's resolve was stronger than any physical pain she felt. She had experienced moments like this before, racism masked as law enforcement, aggression justified as keeping the peace. But this felt different. The sheer arrogance and anger in Green's eyes, his need to prove something to himself by asserting his power, made her realize that this wouldn't end with just a shove. He wasn't satisfied yet. Maya's mind raced as she stood her ground, brushing the dirt off her hands. Every fiber of her being told her to walk away, to not give him what he wanted. But she also knew that there was no easy way out of this. Green had set his sights on her, and until he felt he had completely dominated her, he wouldn't stop. The fear of what might come next hung over her, but it didn't break her. Instead, it made her think faster, sharper. Officer Green stood a few feet away, fists clenched, his breath quickening with excitement. His whole demeanor screamed that he was waiting for her to snap, to give him an excuse to escalate further. Maya saw the cruelty in his eyes, the satisfaction he found in seeing her fall, the thrill of exerting power over her. For him, this was a game, one he had played many times before, and in his mind he always won. But Maya was different. She wasn't some random person he could intimidate. She had dealt with men like him before, men who needed to prove their dominance by belittling others. And she had learned over the years that fear wasn't her enemy, indifference was. She knew she had to maintain her composure. Every response, every move she made had to be calculated. There would be no outbursts, no emotional reactions that could fuel his twisted sense of authority. "You got a lot of nerve," Green said, breaking the tense silence. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the faint light catching the edge of a smirk forming on his face. "Standing there like you're better than me. You people always think you're untouchable." Maya didn't flinch at his words. Inside, she felt the anger rise, but she knew she couldn't let it take over. She had seen how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, especially when they involved people of color and police officers with something to prove. She needed to keep her head. "I'm not trying to be anything," she said quietly, but firmly. "I'm just trying to get home." The simplicity of her statement seemed to set Green off even more. He took a step closer, his boots heavy on the pavement. "Home," he sneered. "You think you can just walk through this neighborhood at night like you own the place?" Maya didn't respond this time. She knew any words would be twisted against her. She stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face calm and unreadable. She wasn't going to let him see her fear. "I don't think you get it," Green continued, now circling her like a predator sizing up its prey. "I make the rules here. And tonight, you're going to learn what happens when you break those rules." It was becoming clear that Green wasn't going to stop. His aggression wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was personal. He needed to see her submit, to break her spirit. He thrived on it. But Maya wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She had something he didn't know about. Someone, rather. Maya's thoughts flashed to her husband, Marcus. A military veteran, Marcus had spent years serving in some of the most dangerous parts of the world. He had seen conflict up close, had dealt with situations far more life-threatening than this one. And although he had long since left the battlefield, Marcus's instincts remained sharp. He had always told Maya that if she ever felt in danger, to let him handle it. He would know what to do. Maya's hand instinctively moved towards her pocket, where her phone was. She knew calling Marcus right now could escalate the situation even further, but she also knew that he needed to know what was happening. Marcus had connections, powerful ones inside the military and beyond. His influence stretched further than Green could ever imagine. And if Marcus found out what this cop was doing, the consequences would be swift and severe. But there was no time to call. Green was too close now, his eyes burning with rage. He reached out, grabbing Maya's arm roughly, pulling her closer. The force of his grip sent a jolt of pain through her shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and refused to show it. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he snarled, his breath hot against her face. "You think you're untouchable because you're some kind of big shot in this city? Newsflash, lady, you're nothing here." Maya's gaze locked onto his. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. She could see the frustration building in Green's eyes. He wanted her to break, to scream, to fight back. But she wouldn't give him that. Not now. Not ever. "You know what?" Green hissed, tightening his grip. "I think it's time we took this down to the station. Maybe a night in a cell will remind you of your place." Maya's heart raced. She knew exactly what a night in a cell could mean for someone like her. She had heard the stories, seen the headlines. People like Green didn't just arrest black women, they humiliated them, degraded them, and sometimes, worse. She couldn't let that happen. But how could she de-escalate this without making things worse? Suddenly, the low rumble of an engine echoed from around the corner, interrupting the tension. Green's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as headlights approached from down the street. Maya's pulse quickened. Was it a passerby? Another cop. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the sound of the approaching vehicle gave her a brief moment of hope. Green's grip loosened slightly, his attention momentarily distracted. He glanced towards the approaching car, trying to assess the situation. It was just enough time for Maya to pull back, her arm slipping from his grasp. She took a quick step back, her hand now gripping her phone tightly in her pocket. The car rolled closer, its engine a low, steady hum. As it neared, Maya could make out the familiar silhouette. It was Marcus. Her heart leapt. Relief flooded her, but she kept her composure. This wasn't over yet. Green hadn't noticed who was in the car. He was too focused on his next move, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could salvage his crumbling control over the situation. Maya, however, knew that Green was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The car came to a slow stop just a few feet away from them, and the driver's side door swung open. Out stepped Marcus, his tall frame illuminated by the headlights. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen battle, who had faced far greater threats than an overzealous cop. His gaze locked onto Green, but his expression remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. Green turned to face Marcus, sizing him up. He didn't recognize him, didn't realize who he was dealing with. To Green, Marcus was just another man trying to interfere. He didn't know that Marcus had the power to bring his entire world crashing down in an instant. "This doesn't concern you," Green spat, his hand still resting on his belt, inching towards his baton. "Move along." Marcus didn't budge. His eyes flicked to Maya, checking to make sure she was okay. She gave him a small nod, her expression saying everything she couldn't put into words. Marcus understood immediately. "This concerns me," Marcus said, his voice growing colder. "That's my wife you just laid your hands on." The weight of Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, sinking into Green's mind. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone like Marcus. "Your wife," Green repeated, his voice shaky now. He tried to regain his composure, but it was too late. Marcus had already seized control of the situation without lifting a finger. "That's right," Marcus replied, stepping closer. "And I suggest you step back before this gets out of hand." Green hesitated. He could feel the shift in power, the sudden change in dynamic. But his pride, his need to assert dominance, wouldn't let him back down. "You threatening me?" Green growled, trying to sound tough, but his voice betrayed him. Marcus smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "No, but if you don't step away from my wife right now, you'll wish I had been." For the first time that night, fear flashed in Green's eyes. And that was the moment he realized he had made a grave mistake. The tension in the air had shifted the moment Marcus stepped out of the car, but Officer Green, blinded by his own arrogance and unchecked authority, couldn't recognize the danger standing right in front of him. In his mind, this was just another man who thought he could talk back to the police, another person he needed to put in their place. But as Marcus took a step closer, something changed in the way Green carried himself. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, his grip on his baton tightening, knuckles going white. He could feel the situation slipping from his grasp, yet his ego demanded he maintain control. The street was quiet, eerily so, as if even the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. A few lights flickered from distant apartment windows, but no one was around to witness what was about to unfold. It was just the three of them, Maya, Marcus, and Green, locked in a moment that could spiral out of control at any second. Marcus stood tall, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside him. Years of military training had taught him discipline, had shaped him into a man who could remain composed in the most dangerous situations. But this was different. This wasn't some war zone in a foreign country, this was his home. And the man who was supposed to be protecting civilians had just assaulted his wife. The restraint Marcus had learned through years of service was the only thing keeping him from snapping, from delivering the kind of justice his instincts screamed for. But he couldn't act recklessly. Not here. Not now. Maya, still standing a few feet behind Marcus, could sense the storm building in her husband. She had seen that look before, in rare moments when he had been pushed to his limit. It was the same look he had when they discussed his experiences during his deployments, when he spoke about the lines he had been forced to cross to protect his fellow soldiers. It was a look that sent a chill down her spine, not because she feared Marcus, but because she knew what he was capable of when pushed too far. Officer Green, oblivious to the brewing danger, made the fatal mistake of doubling down on his aggression. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest in a show of bravado, and took a step toward Marcus, his eyes narrowed, filled with the toxic mix of arrogance and insecurity that had fueled his every action that night. "You think you can just walk in here and start giving orders?" Green spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't the military, pal. You're on my turf now." Marcus's expression remained unchanged. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His mere presence was enough to unsettle Green, and that was something the officer couldn't handle. Green thrived on fear, on the submission of those he deemed weaker. But Marcus wasn't afraid, and that terrified him. "Step back," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "This is your last warning." Green's eyes flared with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who refused to show any fear. His hand, which had been hovering near his baton, now gripped the handle tightly. The leather strap of the baton slid from its holster with a soft hiss, and Green raised it, pointing it directly at Marcus. "You think you're tough?" Green growled. "You think just because you've got some military background you can tell me what to do? Let me remind you of something: you're not in charge here. I am." Marcus didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't react to the threat of the baton. He just stood there, his eyes locked onto Green's with a cold intensity that made the officer's bravado seem hollow. "I'm only going to say this one more time," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "Put down the baton, or you'll regret it." The air around them seemed to thicken, the tension building to a breaking point. Maya's heart raced in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She knew Marcus was trying to de-escalate the situation, but she also knew that if Green made the wrong move, there would be no going back. Green, unable to handle the pressure, snapped. With a sneer, he swung the baton, aiming for Marcus's ribs. The movement was fast, but not fast enough. Marcus, with reflexes honed from years of combat training, sidestepped the blow with ease. His hand shot out like a viper, gripping Green's wrist with a strength that made the officer's eyes widen in shock. For a moment, there was silence. The baton clattered to the ground, the sound echoing down the empty street. Green's face contorted in pain as Marcus twisted his wrist, forcing him to his knees in one fluid motion. It was over in an instant, but to Green, it felt like the world had flipped upside down. "You shouldn't have done that," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm as he released Green's wrist, letting him fall to the ground in a heap. Green scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist, his face flushed with a mix of pain and humiliation. He had been overpowered, humiliated in a matter of seconds, and now his mind was racing, searching for a way to regain control. But there was no coming back from this. The tables had turned, and he knew it. You assaulted an officer," Green stammered, backing away from Marcus. "You're going to jail for this. You hear me? You're done." Marcus didn't respond. He simply turned his back on Green, walking over to Maya and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft now, a stark contrast to the coldness he had shown just moments before. Maya nodded, though her body was still trembling with adrenaline. "I'm fine," she whispered, "but we need to get out of here." She wasn't wrong. They both knew that this situation wasn't over, not by a long shot. Green might have been temporarily subdued, but he wasn't going to let this go. And in a city where the police were often protected by the system, there was no telling what Green would do to retaliate. But Marcus wasn't concerned about that. He had faced worse threats than an angry cop. What concerned him was keeping Maya safe. He had already restrained himself once tonight, but he didn't know how much longer he could keep his anger in check if Green pushed him further. Just as Marcus turned to lead Maya back to the car, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. Backup had arrived. Green's face twisted into a triumphant sneer as the squad cars pulled up. He stumbled to his feet, cradling his injured wrist as he staggered toward the arriving officers. "Arrest him," Green shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "He assaulted me. He's dangerous." Several officers jumped out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, their eyes darting between Marcus and Green, trying to assess the situation. The tension, which had been simmering before, now reached a boiling point. Marcus stood still, his hands at his sides, making no move toward the officers. He knew how quickly things could escalate when police felt threatened, and the last thing he wanted was for one of them to pull the trigger. Maya's pulse quickened. She could see the fear in the officers' eyes as they looked at Marcus, their fingers twitching near the triggers of their guns. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and everything could spiral out of control. "Everyone calm down," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to cut through the chaos but steady enough to convey control. "No one needs to get hurt." Green, still fuming with humiliation, wasn't having it. "Shut up," he barked at Marcus. "You're under arrest. You think you can just attack a cop and walk away?" One of the officers, a sergeant by the look of his uniform, stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of restraint. "Everyone hold your fire," he commanded. His eyes shifted to Marcus, then to Green, and back to Marcus again. He could sense that there was more to this situation than what Green was letting on. "Let's hear what happened," the sergeant said, his tone more measured than Green's. Before Marcus could respond, Green cut in, his voice laced with fury. "What happened?" "He attacked me. I was just doing my job and this psycho comes out of nowhere and assaults me." The sergeant glanced at Marcus, clearly unconvinced by Green's version of events. There was something about Marcus's calm demeanor, the way he carried himself, that made it hard to believe he had just launched an unprovoked attack. Marcus locked eyes with the sergeant. "Your officer assaulted my wife," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I defended her." The sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing at Maya, who was standing slightly behind Marcus, her body tense. "Is that true?" he asked, addressing Maya directly. Maya nodded, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "He grabbed me. He kicked me. My husband was protecting me." The sergeant's face hardened as he processed her words. He looked back at Green, who was still clutching his wrist, glaring at Marcus with barely contained rage. "Is that true, Officer Green?" the sergeant asked, his tone now laced with suspicion. Green opened his mouth to protest, but the sergeant cut him off. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said, waving to the other officers. "Cuff them both, but no rough handling." Marcus's jaw tightened as one of the officers approached him with handcuffs. He didn't resist, knowing that any sign of resistance would only make things worse. But as the cold metal snapped around his wrists, he could feel the anger building inside him once again. This wasn't justice, this was power being abused. And he wasn't going to let it stand. As they were led to separate squad cars, Maya glanced over at Marcus, her eyes filled with worry. She knew that this was far from over. But she also knew that Marcus had a plan. He always did. As the doors of the squad car closed behind her, Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain: Officer Green had made a mistake that was going to cost him dearly. In the distance, the city continued to hum, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The cold, hard metal of the handcuffs dug into Marcus's wrists as he sat silently in the back of the squad car. He had been in tighter situations than this, far tighter. In war zones, he had faced enemies with weapons far deadlier than the one Green had wielded tonight. And yet, the feeling of helplessness now, being shackled by his own country's law enforcement, grated at him in a way that no battlefield had ever managed. This wasn't just about him, it was about Maya. The thought of her being subjected to such violence, for no reason other than walking home, ignited a rage in him that he struggled to keep contained. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to think through every possible outcome before making a move. But this was personal. Every time his mind replayed the scene, Green kicking Maya to the ground, his hands clenched tighter, knuckles whitening as his nails dug into his palms. He was thankful Maya was in a separate squad car. She didn't need to see him like this, boiling over with anger. She needed him to stay composed, to strategize. Outside the window, the city lights blurred as the squad cars made their way to the police station. Marcus's mind was already working through what needed to be done next. He knew how these situations played out. He had seen it too many times: false reports, trumped-up charges, fabricated evidence. He couldn't allow that to happen. Not to Maya, not to himself. But more than that, there was a larger issue at play. Officer Green wasn't just some rogue cop on a power trip. Marcus had seen something in the way the other officers handled the situation, in the way they looked at Green hesitation, but also a sort of silent complicity. This wasn't about one man. It was about a system that enabled and protected men like Green. And if Marcus didn't act smartly, if he let his emotions take over, they would both become casualties of that system. The squad car pulled into the back of the precinct, and Marcus's heart sank. He knew this wasn't a simple arrest. He and Maya had been taken in to be made examples of. Green wouldn't stop until he had buried them both under false charges, using his badge as a shield to protect himself from the consequences of his actions. But Marcus had something Green didn't, connections and the knowledge of how to use them. As they were led into the precinct, Marcus kept his eyes forward, his face a mask of calm control. Maya, walking a few feet ahead of him, glanced over her shoulder, searching for reassurance. Marcus gave her a brief nod. He could see the worry etched across her face, but she was holding it together. Strong, as always. She was his anchor in this storm, and he needed to stay strong for her too. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the room. The officers moved with practiced indifference, their actions routine. This wasn't new for them, just another arrest, another couple of people to process before their shift ended. To them, Marcus and Maya were nothing more than another inconvenience in their daily grind. They were separated into different holding areas. Marcus could feel his jaw tightening as he was led into a small, dimly lit room, the door closing behind him with a loud metallic clang. His hands were uncuffed, and he was pushed into a chair at the center of the room. The officer who brought him in left without a word, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Marcus exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. He needed to remain in control, to think clearly. His mind raced, not with panic, but with strategy. There were protocols to follow, and he knew them well. The military had prepared him for crises, both on the battlefield and off. This was no different. It was a battle, just of a different kind. He knew the system well enough to understand how it worked. The moment the paperwork was filed, they'd likely try to charge him and Maya with resisting arrest, possibly assaulting an officer. Green would undoubtedly spin the story to paint them as the aggressors. The department would back him up, protecting their own, and if Marcus and Maya didn't act quickly, they could be facing criminal charges that would ruin their lives. But Marcus had an advantage. He had a deep network of contacts both in the military and in legal circles. He knew people in high places, people who owed him favors, people who wouldn't hesitate to pull some strings to ensure that he and Maya weren't thrown to the wolves. All he needed was a phone call. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and Officer Green stepped inside, a smug smile plastered on his face. His wrist was bandaged now, but the look of satisfaction on his face told Marcus that he was still basking in the power trip. "Enjoying yourself?" Green asked, leaning casually against the wall, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're not looking so tough now, are you?" Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any retort could be. It unnerved Green, and Marcus could see the frustration flicker across the officer's face. Green wanted him to react, to lash out, but Marcus wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "You know," Green continued, pacing around the room, "I'm doing you a favor, bringing you in like this. Could have been a lot worse for you and your wife if I hadn't been so generous." Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Generous." Green smirked. That's right. I could have filed a lot more charges against you. Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest. But I'm willing to be lenient if you cooperate. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He could see where this was going. Green wasn't just looking for an arrest, he was looking for leverage. He wanted Marcus to give in, to admit to something he hadn't done, to submit to the authority Green was so desperate to wield. What do you want? Marcus asked, cutting through Green's thinly veiled threats. Green stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. I want you to understand how things work around here. You think just because you've got some military background, you can come in here and throw your weight around? Newsflash, pal, that doesn't mean shit in this city. I run things here, and you're going to learn that real quick. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. You're mistaken if you think I'm going to play your game. Green's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a hint of annoyance. You think you're in control here? You're not. I've got enough dirt on you and your wife to bury you both. So I suggest you drop the tough guy act and cooperate. Marcus's eyes hardened. He knew Green was bluffing, but the longer they were held here, the more dangerous the situation became. They needed to act fast. He needed to make that phone call. Let me make something clear, Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with authority. You think you have control, but you don't. You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of. So I suggest you rethink whatever it is you're planning, because this won't end the way you think it will. Green stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken threats. But Marcus remained unflinching, his gaze steady, unwavering. Green's confidence faltered for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure, pushing off the wall and heading for the door. You've got one chance to make this easy on yourself, Green said, his hand on the door handle. Don't blow it. With that, he left the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Marcus sat in the silence, his mind racing. He needed to act, and fast. The longer they were kept here, the more dangerous the situation became. Minutes later, the door opened again, and this time, a different officer entered, a sergeant by the look of his stripes. He was older, more seasoned, and he carried himself with a level of professionalism that immediately set him apart from Green. Mr. Jackson, the sergeant began, his voice calm. I've been asked to handle this case from here. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the change. He could sense that this man was more measured, more careful with his approach. But Marcus knew that didn't necessarily mean he could be trusted. Your wife is in the other room, being processed, the sergeant continued. We're still trying to get a full picture of what happened tonight, but I want to give you a chance to explain your side of things. Marcus didn't hesitate. Officer Green assaulted my wife. I defended her. The sergeant listened carefully, his face unreadable. That's a serious accusation. And it's the truth, Marcus replied. The sergeant nodded slowly, as if weighing his options. I'm going to need to confirm a few things before we proceed. But for now, you'll be kept in holding until we sort this out. Marcus's eyes narrowed. I need to make a phone call. The sergeant hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. One call. Make it count. Marcus didn't waste any time. The moment the phone was in his hand, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a direct line to a high-ranking military official he had served with during his last deployment. If there was anyone who could help pull strings in this situation, it was him. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Jackson, it's been a while. Marcus cut straight to the point. I need a favor. My wife and I are being held at a precinct downtown. We were assaulted by a police officer, and now he's trying to pin the blame on us." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low sigh. "I'll make a few calls. Sit tight. This won't take long." Marcus thanked him and hung up the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had put the wheels in motion, but now it was a waiting game. Back in her holding cell, Maya sat on a cold bench, her mind racing. She knew Marcus was working on something. He always had a plan, but the fear still gnawed at her. She had seen the way Green looked at her, the hatred in his eyes. He wasn't going to stop until they were both ruined. But Maya wasn't one to back down. She had fought her entire life for justice, for equality, and she wasn't about to let some corrupt cop destroy everything she and Marcus had built. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and they would come out on top. Maya sat on the cold metal bench in her holding cell, the sterile white walls closing in around her like a cage. Every breath she took echoed back to her, the silence of the station overwhelming. She could feel the weight of the night's events pressing down on her chest like an anvil. It wasn't the first time she had been targeted by someone like Green, someone who saw her as a threat, just because she refused to fit into the mold he had for people who looked like her. But this time was different. This time, it had escalated beyond anything she had ever experienced before. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her nerves. Marcus. She knew Marcus was working on something. He always was. He was methodical, strategic, never one to make a move without thinking 10 steps ahead. But this wasn't a battlefield or some covert military operation. This was a system that was designed to protect itself, a system that Marcus might not be able to outmaneuver, no matter how clever he was. The fear gnawed at her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't let herself spiral. Not now. The door to her holding cell creaked open, and an officer walked in, his expression unreadable. He wasn't Green, but that didn't make her feel any safer. He was here to assert control, to remind her that she was at their mercy. For now. "You've got a visitor," the officer said flatly, his eyes not meeting hers as he gestured for her to follow him. Maya's heart raced. A visitor? She hadn't expected anyone. She knew Marcus was working behind the scenes, but it was too soon for anything to happen, wasn't it? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more anxiety-inducing than the last. But she kept her expression calm, her steps measured, as she followed the officer down the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly, the sound grating on her nerves. They passed by several holding cells, each one occupied by a figure slumped on a bench, their eyes dull and defeated. Maya swallowed hard, refusing to let herself fall into the same mindset. She wouldn't let this place break her. Not now. Not ever. They reached a small interrogation room at the end of the hallway. The officer gestured for her to go inside, and she stepped through the door, her pulse quickening. Inside, sitting at the table, was a man she didn't recognize. He was dressed sharply in a dark suit, his hair perfectly combed, his face calm and professional. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, or maybe calculation. "Mrs. Jackson," the man said, rising to his feet and extending a hand. "My name is Carter. I'm an attorney sent by some mutual acquaintances. Please have a seat." Maya hesitated for a moment, studying him. There was something about him that felt off, not untrustworthy, exactly, but like he was holding something back. Still, he was her only option right now. She shook his hand and sat down across from him, her mind still racing. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes narrowing slightly. Carter smiled. but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Let's just say that your husband has some very powerful friends. Friends who don't appreciate what's happening here. Maya's pulse quickened. So Marcus had already reached out. Of course he had. But the presence of this man, this smooth-talking, slick attorney, made her feel uneasy. What kind of strings had Marcus pulled? And what price would they have to pay for it? You and your husband are in a difficult situation, Mrs. Jackson Carter continued, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Officer Green is already spinning his narrative. As far as the department is concerned, he's the victim here, and they're going to back him up, unless we act quickly. Maya nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. She had expected this. The system always protected its own, especially when the people on the other side looked like her. She had seen it too many times to be surprised. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice clipped. She didn't have time for pleasantries or drawn-out explanations. She needed answers. Now. Carter's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "We need to establish a counter-narrative. Something that shows the truth, or at least enough of the truth to cast doubt on Green's version of events. I'm here to help you and your husband navigate this, but you need to be completely honest with me. Every detail matters." Maya leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "You think they'll believe us over him?" she asked, her voice heavy with skepticism. Carter didn't hesitate. "They don't need to believe you," he said simply. "They just need to doubt him." Maya raised an eyebrow. It was a cold, calculating response, but she knew it was true. This wasn't about justice. It was about casting enough doubt to make the case fall apart, to make Green's accusations look flimsy, and to make the department second-guess its support for him. "So what's the plan?" she asked, her voice firm now, her mind sharpening with focus. Carter leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "First, we need to establish your husband's military background, his reputation. That will work in our favor. Marcus is a decorated veteran, and that carries weight. We'll use that to paint him as a protector, someone who acted out of necessity to defend his wife." Maya nodded. That made sense. Marcus's reputation was impeccable. He had always carried himself with honor, and people respected him for it. But she could already sense that it wouldn't be enough. Green had the power of the badge on his side, and that carried a lot of weight in this city. "And you," Carter continued, his eyes scanning her face. "We need to establish you as a credible witness. We'll use your work as an activist, your community ties. You're not some random person off the street. You're someone with a voice, someone who's respected in your circles." Maya stiffened slightly at the mention of her activism. She had spent years fighting against systemic injustices, and the thought of having to leverage her work to save herself felt wrong. But she knew this was the game they had to play. It wasn't about what felt right, it was about survival. "And what about Green?" Maya asked, her voice hardening. "How do we expose him for what he is?" Carter's expression darkened slightly. "That's where things get tricky. Green is protected by the department, and they're not going to turn on him unless they have no other choice. We need something that forces their hand. Something that makes him look like a liability." Maya's mind raced. There had to be something. Men like Green didn't just explode out of nowhere. There was always a history, a pattern. She had seen it before in her activism, officers who had a string of complaints but were never held accountable until it was too late. If they could find something in Green's past, something that showed a history of abuse or misconduct, it could be enough to tip the scales. "There has to be something," Maya said, her voice determined. "Something in his record. He didn't just start acting like this tonight." Carter nodded. I've already started looking into it. We've got a few leads, but nothing concrete yet. However, if there's anything you can think of, anything at all that might help us build that case, it could be critical. Maya's mind flashed back to the look in Green's eyes when he first approached her. The way he had sized her up, the way he had immediately escalated the situation without cause. She had seen that look before. It wasn't the look of someone enforcing the law. It was the look of someone with a chip on his shoulder, someone who thrived on control and violence. I don't know specifics, Maya said slowly, but I could tell. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. Carter gave her a measured look, then nodded. That's enough for now. We'll keep digging. He stood up, gathering his papers into a neat stack. I'm going to meet with your husband next. We'll get through this, Mrs. Jackson. You just need to stay strong. Maya stood as well, though her mind was still racing with possibilities. She had to trust that Marcus and Carter were working on something, but the weight of the situation felt heavier with each passing moment. As Carter left the room, Maya sat back down, closing her eyes for a moment. The cold metal of the chair pressed into her back, a stark reminder of where she was, of how easily everything could slip out of control. Meanwhile, across the precinct, Marcus was sitting in a similar room, his mind racing. He had expected resistance. He had known from the moment he laid eyes on Green that this wouldn't be a clean break. But the situation was spiraling faster than even he had anticipated. The network of contacts he had spent years building could only do so much, and now the clock was ticking. As the door to his room creaked open, Marcus looked up to see Carter step inside. The man's calm demeanor did little to reassure Marcus, but he knew that if anyone could help them navigate this, it was Carter. Jackson, Carter said, sitting down across from him. We've got work to do. Marcus nodded. Tell me what you've got. Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's not good. Green is pushing hard for charges resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. He's got the department backing him up, and they're not going to budge unless we force them to. Marcus's jaw clenched. He had expected this, but hearing it confirmed only fueled his anger. And how do we force them? We've got two options, Carter said, leaning forward. We either dig up something on Green, something big enough to make the department see him as a liability, or we lean hard on your military background and community ties to build a public narrative that makes it impossible for them to justify keeping you here. Marcus's mind was already working through the possibilities. His military background was solid, but he knew Green would try to paint him as a threat, as someone who had used his combat training against an officer. The key was to make sure they controlled the narrative, that they presented Marcus as a protector, not an aggressor. And what about Green's past? Marcus asked. There's got to be something. Men like him don't just pop up out of nowhere. Carter nodded. We're digging. There's a chance we'll find something, but we're running out of time. If we don't make a move soon, Green's version of events will become the official story, and it'll be that much harder to undo. Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly. They were running out of options and fast, but there was still time. There had to be. I'll make a few more calls, Carter said, standing up. But you need to be ready. This could get ugly. Marcus nodded, his face hardening. I've been through worse. As Carter left the room, Marcus sat in the silence, his mind racing. They were up against a system designed to protect men like Green, a system that didn't care about the truth as long as it maintained its power. But Marcus wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The fight was just beginning. The walls of the precinct felt as if they were closing in. Time had become a slippery concept for Marcus as he sat in the holding room, every ticking second tightening the noose around him and Maya. He knew that if they didn't act quickly, they would lose control of the narrative, and Green would win. The system would close ranks around him, protecting him like it always did with officers like him. The thought gnawed at Marcus, but it also fueled his resolve. It wasn't just about him and Maya anymore. This was about something much larger. Marcus had spent years fighting for justice in foreign lands, risking his life for principles he believed in, principles of fairness, of protection, of honor. Yet here, in his own country, those principles were being eroded by the very people who were supposed to uphold them. The door creaked open once more, and Carter entered, his expression grim but focused. He moved quickly, setting down a file on the table in front of Marcus. "We've got something," he said, his voice low and urgent. Marcus leaned forward, his muscles tensing. He could tell by the look in Carter's eyes that it wasn't just any piece of evidence. This was the turning point. "We've uncovered several complaints against Green," Carter continued, all buried, of course. Excessive force, racial profiling, unlawful arrests. None of it ever made it to an official investigation, but it's enough to raise questions about his credibility. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the reality of the situation. Complaints didn't always lead to action, especially in a system designed to protect men like Green. But it was a start. It was a crack in the armor. "That's good," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But is it enough?" Carter shook his head. "It's a piece of the puzzle, but we need more. We need to build a case that makes Green too toxic for the department to defend. We can use his history, but we have to tie it to tonight's show that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of abuse." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He knew they didn't have much time. Green was undoubtedly working on his own story, and if they didn't move fast, they'd be outmaneuvered. Carter sat down across from Marcus, his expression serious. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've heard whispers off the record, of course, that Green's connected to a broader network within the department. Corruption, payoffs, the works." Marcus raised an eyebrow. This was new information, and it changed everything. If Green was part of a corrupt network, it meant the stakes were even higher than he had realized. It wasn't just about protecting Green's career, it was about protecting a system of corruption that could unravel if exposed. "That's why they're protecting him so fiercely," Carter continued. "If Green goes down, he could take a lot of people with him." Marcus felt the weight of those words. This was no longer a personal battle, it was a war against a system that had been built to maintain power at all costs. And now, he and Maya were caught in the middle of it. "How do we use that?" Marcus asked, his voice cold and calculated. Carter leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "We expose it. We put pressure on the department, make it clear that if they don't distance themselves from Green, they'll go down with him. But it's risky. If we play this wrong, they could double down, and we'll be buried before we even have a chance." Marcus nodded. He understood the stakes. It was a delicate balancing act, but it was the only option they had. "What's our next move?" Marcus asked, his voice firm. Carter leaned back, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "We need to get this out in the open, and fast. I've reached out to a few people in the media who are sympathetic to our cause. They'll run with the story, but we need something concrete, something that ties Green's corruption directly to his actions tonight." Marcus's mind raced. There had to be something that would connect the dots and force the department's hand. And then it hit him. The baton. The moment when Green had crossed the line from being an aggressor to outright assault. He dropped his baton, Marcus said slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. When he tried to hit me, I disarmed him. It's still out there, on the street where it happened. Carter's eyes widened slightly. If we can recover that baton, it could be the evidence we need to show excessive force. Combine that with his history, and we might have a shot. Marcus nodded, already thinking of how they could retrieve it. Can we get someone to go back and find it? Carter stood up, his movements quick and purposeful. I'll make some calls. If we can get the baton, we can match it to Green's issued weapon, and it'll be hard for them to explain why it was on the ground in the middle of an arrest. As Carter left the room to make the necessary arrangements, Marcus sat in the silence, his mind still buzzing with the possibilities. They had a chance now, a real chance to turn the tide, but he knew that Green wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him never did. In her separate holding room, Maya sat with her hands folded in her lap, her mind working through everything Carter had told her earlier. She knew Marcus was working behind the scenes, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The thought of Green walking away from this unscathed, continuing his pattern of violence and abuse, made her blood boil. Just then the door to her room opened, and Carter stepped inside, his expression intense but composed. We've got a plan, he said, sitting down across from her. But we need your help. Maya leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Carter's. What do you need? Carter explained the situation, Green's history of abuse, the potential to expose him, and the critical piece of evidence they needed to recover the baton. He laid it all out in simple, concise terms, his tone urgent but steady. We need you to corroborate what happened, Carter said. The moment he lost control and used excessive force. We have to make it clear that this wasn't just an arrest gone wrong, this was an assault. Maya nodded. She had already been mentally preparing herself to testify, to tell the truth about what had happened that night. She knew her word alone wouldn't be enough to bring Green down, but combined with the evidence Carter was working to collect, it could be the tipping point. I'll do whatever it takes, Maya said, her voice strong. He needs to pay for what he's done. Carter smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. We're going to make sure he does. As Carter left the room, Maya leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. They were getting closer, but she knew that they were walking a fine line. The department would fight tooth and nail to protect one of their own, especially if Green's corruption ran deeper than they initially thought. But if they could just get that one piece of evidence, the baton, it could turn the entire case upside down. Hours later, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Word had begun to spread about the growing scandal surrounding Green. The media had caught wind of the story, thanks to Carter's connections, and reporters were starting to ask questions. Green, who had once strutted around the station with an air of invincibility, was now avoiding eye contact with his fellow officers, the pressure mounting on him. Carter returned to Marcus's holding room, his expression triumphant. We got it, he said, holding up a photo on his phone. The baton's been recovered. It matches Green's issued weapon, and it was found exactly where you said it would be. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had what they needed. Now it was just a matter of time before the department would have to make a choice: protect Green and risk being dragged into a corruption scandal, or cut their losses and let him fall. We're pushing this to the top, Carter continued. With the media breathing down their necks and the evidence stacking up, the department won't be able to defend him for long. Marcus nodded, the tension in his body easing slightly. They had a chance now, a real chance, to take Green down and expose the corruption festering within the department. As the hours ticked by, Marcus and Maya were finally released from custody. The charges against them had been dropped, and Green's career was now hanging by a thread. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As they walked out of the precinct, the cool night air hitting their faces, Maya turned to Marcus, her expression resolute. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, her hand slipping into his. Marcus nodded, his gaze focused on the horizon. "We're not done yet." The night air felt cool and fresh against Maya's skin as she and Marcus stepped out of the precinct, free at last. The weight of the ordeal had been heavy, but now there was a sense of fragile relief. It wasn't a triumphant victory, but it was a step closer to justice. As they walked toward their car, the streets were quieter than usual. The city had settled into its usual rhythm, unaware of the storm that had just passed or the one that was still brewing beneath the surface. Marcus paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if calculating the next move. He had been in countless battles, but this one felt different. This wasn't a fight with clear enemies or obvious tactics. It was a war waged in boardrooms, precincts, and courtrooms, a war where power wasn't wielded through physical strength, but through influence, connections, and corruption. Maya's hand slipped into his, and he squeezed it gently. They had both been through so much tonight, and though the immediate danger had passed, they both knew that this wasn't over. Officer Green might be on the brink of losing his career, but the system that had protected him for so long remained. That system had barely been touched. It was still out there, operating in the shadows, protecting men like Green, waiting for the heat to die down. As they drove home, the weight of that realization hung between them. Maya stared out of the window, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over again. There was no satisfaction in knowing that Green might face consequences. It wasn't enough. He wasn't just a single bad actor. He was part of a larger machine, a machine that would keep turning unless someone stopped it. Back at home, the silence of the house felt suffocating. Marcus set his keys down on the kitchen table, the metal clinking against the wood with a hollow sound. Maya dropped onto the couch, leaning her head back, her eyes closed. The adrenaline of the night had finally worn off, leaving her feeling drained and empty. "We're not done, are we?" Maya asked quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness. Marcus stood across from her, his arms folded across his chest. He shook his head, his expression serious. "No, we've exposed Green, but there's more going on here. Carter was right, this goes deeper. Green's just the tip of the iceberg." Maya opened her eyes and looked up at him. "So what do we do now?" Marcus took a deep breath, his mind already turning over the possibilities. He had friends, powerful friends in the military, in government, even in the media. He had connections that could help them push this further, to root out the corruption in the police department and expose the people protecting Green. But it would be dangerous. It would mean going up against a system that was designed to crush people like them. "We keep pushing," Marcus said finally. "We use everything we've got. We're not just going after Green anymore. We're going after the people who made him feel like he could get away with this." Maya nodded slowly. She had spent her life fighting for justice, but this felt different. This wasn't about protests or speeches or community work. This was a battle that would be fought behind closed doors, in the halls of power, where the stakes were much higher. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "Then we fight," she said, her voice steady. "We take them down." Marcus gave a small nod of agreement, his face hardening with determination. He had always known that his skills would be needed off the battlefield one day, and now it seemed that day had come. This was a war he hadn't expected, but one he was more than ready to fight. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Carter worked tirelessly, pulling every string he could to make sure Green's case didn't just fade into the background. The media attention grew, and soon more stories about Green's misconduct began to surface, and former victims who had been too afraid to speak out before now felt empowered by Marcus and Maya's fight. Complaints that had been buried by the department were suddenly re-examined, and Green's career unraveled before his eyes. But it wasn't just Green who was under scrutiny. As the investigation deepened, more officers were implicated. Corruption that had been simmering beneath the surface for years was finally starting to come to light. Officers who had turned a blind eye to Green's behavior, who had falsified reports, or who had taken bribes were being named in internal investigations. The department was in chaos. The once impenetrable wall of silence that had protected men like Green was starting to crack. And with every new revelation, Marcus and Maya's resolve only grew stronger. It wasn't easy. There were threats, anonymous phone calls, and whispered warnings from people who knew the risks of going up against such a powerful system. But Marcus had been in far worse situations, and Maya had spent her life standing up to injustice. They weren't going to back down now. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching the news coverage of the growing scandal, Maya leaned against Marcus, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had made progress. They had forced the system to reckon with its own corruption, and that was no small feat. "You think it'll stick?" Maya asked quietly, her voice filled with both hope and doubt. Marcus didn't answer right away. He knew how systems like this worked. They were resilient, designed to protect themselves at all costs. But he also knew that once you exposed the rot at the core, it was hard to hide it again. "It'll stick," Marcus said finally. "And if it doesn't, we'll keep fighting until it does." Maya smiled softly, her hand finding his. They had faced down so much together, and there would be more battles to come. But for now they had each other, and that was enough. As the news anchor continued to report on the investigation, the camera panned to a protest outside the precinct, where people held signs demanding justice, demanding accountability. It was a reminder that this wasn't just their fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the system, for every person who had been silenced by fear. And Marcus and Maya were ready to lead that fight.